Welcome to tonight's Design Forum. I'm Professor Benjamin Bennis. I teach art and design history in the design program, and I am super excited to welcome you all to a really special Design Forum tonight. Before I introduce our guest, Professor Pablo Zavala, I want to just briefly describe the plan for this forum as we've envisioned it. Dr. Zavala will start us off with a short talk based on one of the chapters from his recently published book, about which I'll say more momentarily. After this, I'll join Pablo on stage for a brief informal conversation about some of the book's broader themes, and then from there we'll open up the conversation to the audience, as I'm sure many of you will have questions, comments. And then finally, we'll wrap up with a reception in the lobby, courtesy of the event's co-sponsors, the Department of Languages and Cultures and the Latin American Studies program. In addition to excellent food, there will also be a limited number of copies of Pablo's book available for purchase, and so we hope you'll hang around for that. Our speaker tonight, Pablo Zavala, is Assistant Professor of Spanish and Latin American Studies in Loyola's Department of Languages and Cultures, as well as Director of Loyola's Latin American Studies program. He earned a PhD in Hispanic Studies from Washington University in St. Louis. His research centers on Mexican and Latin American literary and visual culture, within which he explores how ideas about identity intersect with politics, state formation, and print media. His articles have appeared in a variety of academic journals, including Studies in Spanish and Latin American Cinemas and Southwest Philosophical Studies, among others. His book, which was just published this month by University of Arizona Press, is titled Forging a Mexican People, Collective Subjectivities in Post-Revolutionary Print Culture. This is the book right here, and on a personal note, I'll tell you that I absolutely love this book, and I can't recommend it enough. I was intrigued when I learned last year that Pablo was completing a book on this topic, as one of my own interests as an art historian is the intersection of graphic art and politics. And while my own writing is focused mostly on Europe during the same period, I can already see how the questions and arguments that the book raises will be important for my own thinking. And moreover, as I think you'll see, Professor Zavala's historical account has particular resonance in light of our own current political moment. So we're really fortunate to have him here with us tonight. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor Pablo Zavala.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. I really, really appreciate you being here. Thank you so much to Dr. Bennis. The grace, the warmth, and the collegiality that Dr. Bennis has shown reminds me of why I love working here. So thank you so much for your help. Thank you also to Mr. Matt Normand. Thank you for the help with the flyer. I really enjoyed it. Thank you to Dr. Daniela Marks for helping with bring this project to fruition. The Department of Design, the School of Communication and Design, Dr. Nathan Henney. He's not here because he's getting the food from Normas. So that's the food that we're going to have, and everybody needs to get food because we're bringing a lot for you. So please hang in there, and then you can eat some delicious food. Dr. Karen Rosenbecker, thank you so much for your help with this project. She's the chair of Languages and Cultures. And so, as Dr. Bennis was saying, this talk is a chapter of the book. The book represents the intersection of several conversations. Among these are global conversations that are of interest to a wide heterogeneous audience. Historians, for instance, students of history, if you're interested in history, this is going to be of interest to you. The title of the book, as we've already said, Forging a Mexican People, Collective Subjectivities in Post-Revolutionary Print Culture, 1917 to 1968. Students and people that are interested in nation building, because this period takes place after 1920, which is when Mexico's revolution ended. People that are interested in theorizations of the people. So this book also dialogues with that, going back to crowd psychologists like Sigmund Freud and Jose Ortega y Gasset. what I'm going to do now is briefly, in a few seconds, I'm going to read the index, and then I'm going to go to 1968. The first chapter focuses on a magazine, marking modernity, the aesthetics of sanitized exposed subjectivities, in El Universal Ilustrado, 1917 to 1925. See in red, the communist agrarian people, and the treacherous Mexican state. In El Machete, 1924 to 1927, that's a communist newspaper. The masses and the prints of the Taller de Gráfica Popular, the popular graphic art workshop, 1930s to 1960s. Now it's no longer one cultural object, but a movement with many prints, and specifically printmaking, with a tradition that goes back to Jose Guadalupe Posada. And lastly, Mexican and Chicano political collective subjectivities and protest graphic art in the 60s and 70s. Half of that chapter is Mexico City. The other half is Southwest California in the United States. What happened in 1968 is that the Summer Olympics were happening in Mexico City in October. Now, in July 22nd, there were two high school student groups that got into a fight in downtown Mexico City. Because these students got into a fight, the city government sent riot police to repress these students and to calm them down. But they did it in a violent way. Now, this, in conjunction with simmering tensions between workers and the government that had been happening for 10 years because specifically Mexico City workers, wanted better working conditions, and the fact that the Summer Olympics were happening in a few months boiled over with incredible and infamous violence. So here I have a picture of 1968, the same year, a week later. So as soon as the students were repressed, all of civil society, at least in Mexico City, but all over the country, joined in and joined the protests against the government. A week later, this happened daily, by the way. A week later, here I have a picture of what's called el bazucazo, because with a bazooka, soldiers tore down the wooden door of a college called San Ildefonso. Here's another picture of that. One student was killed that day. A couple of weeks later, hundreds of thousands of Mexico City residents marched to the Zócalo to protest against the repression that the government was carrying at that time. Here they have the image of Che Guevara. He had just been assassinated the previous year, and he became a Pan-American icon of resistance. So no longer just the Zapata that is particular to Mexico, but now we have a rebel with long hair that fits very well with the countercultural tradition of rock and roll and sex and drugs, and add to that rebellion, right, and this resistance movement. A little over a month later, something unthinkable happens. It's going to get worse, but the army enters and occupies the most prestigious university of Mexico, the Autonomous National University of Mexico. They are in there for 12 days. And this is severe because universities in Latin America have historically been beacons of resistance against imperialism and colonialism. So for this to happen is just something that had no precedence in the country. It's something similar happened in El Salvador when the government there in 1989 murdered Jesuit priests. And so here in the Peace Squad, we name it that way to remember those priests. My argument is that Mexico City's 1968 urban popular student movement synthesized protest graphic art and militant propaganda to shape politics, community, and citizenship. The movement simultaneously crafted and reflected collective subjectivities through a unique visual vocabulary that consisted of symbols and satirical images to denounce state oppression. Students produced imagery to protest the paternalistic government's repression and brutal intervention in schools. Importantly, and this is the important part of the argument, such imagery was crucial to the success of other strategies like rallies and protests. So let's look to see how this worked. Arguably, one of the most famous and important images of that summer was this print by Adolfo Michak. It's called Freedom of Expression. He made it in 1954 when he was in Chiapas, making little booklets to teach indigenous Tzotzil and Tzeltal children Spanish. Now, if we go back to 1954, let's remember what happened that year. It's no longer the good neighbor policy of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Now, the United States has a really aggressive and jingoist foreign policy. In 1954, the CIA helps mount a coup against the democratically elected president of Guatemala, Jacobo Arbenz. This is this year, the same year that Adolfo Mechac is there in Chiapas, which is right next door to Guatemala. The other thing that's happening that is influencing this image, because this image portrays censorship and repression. So we have repression in Guatemala. The other thing that happens is that in 1954, Frida Kahlo dies. She was a communist, and she wanted the communist flag draped over her coffin. Obviously, it's also the middle of the Cold War and McCarthyism, but the director of an important institution in Mexico City complies, the Imbal, and he gets fired because of it. So censorship, right? That should be part of free speech. So in the image, we have an indigenous child of color being censored, but not only being censored, it's not just a handkerchief, being censored with chains. So now we have torture. He's being tortured. If you look at his eyes, the expression that the child has, right? He's being tortured, and it's a child also, right? But he's also being silenced. So again, we have censorship and repression. This image is also really important because it talks to us about several different things. For one, it has a decolonial content. For another thing, here really the medium is the message. So this is a lithograph, and printmaking has a strong tradition in Mexico that goes back to Jose Guadalupe Posada. He died in 1913. And ever since, 10 years after his death, muralists and now artists and even Latinx artists in the US and places like Chicago refer to Posada as an inspiration both aesthetically and ideologically, right? Printmakers in Mexico say that they're making art for the people, and it's largely by the people. It's cheaply done. It's no longer elite artists. Some of the muralists were elite artists like Diego Rivera. The last thing that I want to mention about this print is that it represents the collectiveness of printmaking. Because it was done in 54 by Mechac. 14 years later, in 1968, his students asked him for the image. And they said, can we borrow this image? We're in the middle of big protests. He said yes. The students added the phrase, freedom of expression, and they added the famous Olympic logo by Lance Wyman, Mexico 68. So that directly ties the print to the socio-political context at that time, but also tied to the resistance and decolonial context of 10 years earlier, which is also when workers were fighting for their rights. So let's look now at how these images were circulated, how they were distributed, how they were consumed, and how they were made. On the bottom right, we have a bus by the Polytechnic. It's a bus of an institute, of the Polytechnic National Institute, the IPN, which housed one of the high schools that started the skirmish in July 22nd. The bus is plastered with prints, and the bus circled around the city for people to see the prints, right? For people to gain consciousness of whatever the message of the students were. Let's look at some examples of those prints that are on the side of the bus. On the left-hand side, we have a print by Jesus Martinez. It's a peace dove being penetrated by a murderer's bayonet, and there's blood coming out. So, the message is that we have the Summer Olympics, yes, and this is one of the reasons why the government is repressing violently and in a deadly manner the students. And the students are saying, but there's people that are dying literally. So, yes, the peace dove, but also murderer's bayonet. In the middle, we have an image of a gorilla, which is how, at that time, Mexicans referred to the riot police. And it's also a famous cartoon at that time by a cartoonist who went by the name of Rius. And the cartoons were called Super Macho and Los Agachados. And it says, the disbandment of the body of granaderos, or riot police. This is one of the 5 demands that what became the biggest multi-institutional organization had, the CNH, the National Student Strike Council. And they had 5 demands. One of their demands was, please disband this riot police. They're violent, they're cruel, and they're killing people. That demand wasn't satisfied until 2018, 2019 by the mayor at that time, Claudia Sheinbaum, who today is the president of the country. But she replaced it with 2 other similar groups that now also sort of go in whenever there's riots and protests, like March 8th, which is very big for Mexico, and feminists go out and spray paint the monuments. The last print is called No Más Agresión, No More Aggression. And let me open up the page real quick. That one is a print, a serigrafía, which is silk screen print, and it's made by Francisco Moreno Capdevila. It's based on a photograph taken 10 years earlier in the 50s. And so the photograph was taken by Enriquez Bordes Mangel in 1958, who later worked for the Cuban Prensa Latina, founded in 1959, during the massive protests in Mexico City, in which railroad workers and telegraph operators joined teachers, represented by the newly created union, Teachers Revolutionary Movement, led by Othón Salazar. I like this print because it also encapsulates the dual struggle of students and workers. This is another theme that we see during 1968, theorized by writers like José Revueltas and shown in prints, in prints like this one, right? So it also talks about what we often call the long 60s. It's called the long 60s because it goes from the late 1950s, which is when workers were fighting for their rights, until 1972, which is when in Chile, the CIA again helped mount a coup against the democratically elected president of Chile, Salvador Allende. So I have a clip, and I'm not sure if it's going to work, but we're going to try it out now. This clip is from a documentary called El Grito from 1968. It's a very raw documentary. There is no voiceover narrative. It was censored for many years because it was dangerous to show images of the repression. And let's see what the time is going to be at 1:11. I'm going to show just 1 minute. This is available freely on YouTube now. The scene is of how students were making the prints. Oh, you can't see it. What's that? What do we see? Oh, here we go. I think I got it. I just ended the show. So here we go. Now
jóvenes y ancianos, pues lo mismo da, te piden que pares, quieren que detengas la guerra del Vietnam, quítate la venda, niégate a luchar, o ponga las leyes hechas para matar, y si existe el cielo, como el mundo está, piensa en el primero, antes de disparar. Ay, 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 ese llanto triste de niños solitarios, que huérfanos dejan tus viles mercenarios. Son mujeres solas que vagan sin hogar, que a gritos te ruegan, pares la masacre, no seas inmoral, negros y amarillos, tus hermanos son. No los asesines, denles compasión, porque que si con sangre tu historia has de hacer, ese mismo río te hará perecer. Ah, ah, ah.
Okay. Lastly, so that scene that we saw was students making the prints, and then they would take them out, put them on buses, but they would also take them out in signs and protest. That film is legendary. Again, it's raw. It's considered one of the most faithful because it's just raw images. It doesn't appease the viewer. It's more to bear witness and show us, right, the images. There is no image of October 2nd, which is when the government killed hundreds of unarmed civilians. So there is no, because there's no, they just didn't capture any footage, so there's no footage of that, but it captures the whole summer. I'm gonna end the talk, these last couple of minutes, by talking about one last thing. The students were able to circumvent the official narrative of the government and the official narrative of the official press. So let's look at how they did that. The government, and for some reason the mainstream media, were reproducing the narrative of the government, which essentially said, it's the fault of the students that all of this is happening. The fact that students are being repressed, that civilians are being killed, it's the fault of the students. That was the government narrative, and that was the narrative that the main newspapers of the day reproduced, like El Sol. El Sol was a national chain that continues to this day that has specific headquarters or specific newspapers in important cities, like Mexico City. This one is El Sol de Mexico, which is in Mexico City, and it says, enough, says the people. It goes on to blame the students who carried on a march to the Zócalo, to the main space in Mexico City, and it tells them, it says, the people say enough. The people say they don't want these protests anymore. That's what the main newspaper says. This is from August 28, 1968. This is a little cartoon that I found from another mainstream newspaper. It's actually the oldest newspaper in the country that continues to this day, called El Universal. It says, algo es algo, something is something. Well, my son didn't go to his final exams, but as a guerrilla, he is one of the most qualified. So it's poking fun at the students, right? And there's the dad talking to his friend and is saying, well, you know, he's not good in school, but he goes and he's taking Molotov cocktails and he's out in the protests. So poking fun, right, at the protests and implying that they're inherently violent. This one is a lino cut, so a type of, it's printmaking by Jorge Pérez Vega. It says 1968, year of the sold out press. And it shows a rabid dog. He's talking into microphones and speaking into a TV. So it's saying that the talking heads that are on TV, and TV by the 60s, right, you had black and white, but there is still news reports, and it's not only the print newspaper, printing press, but it's TV too, that is spewing the same narrative as the government, is what this print is saying, right? And again, printmaking is cheap, and you're able to plaster it, just like we saw in the clip. You're able to mass produce it, plaster it in different places, and take it anywhere, flyer, and that's exactly, if you keep watching the documentary, that's exactly what the students were doing, is flyering and flyering and flyering. And they also had their own newspaper at this university that I was talking about. So, to conclude, these printmakers forged collective subjectivities embedded within impressive prints made with techniques passed down since Posada. The prints were formidable in their own right, insightful alternative versions of nations and their people. These artists challenged dominant narratives and circumvented official channels by creating their own circuits of distribution through which they circulated prints of a third people, to use Chiari's term, that exposed the state's violence and produced a non-hegemonic conception of the Mexican people. Thank you.
Can you just wave when it's like 5:45, and then we can take the mic to people who might have questions. Okay, well, thank you so much for that. It's a absolutely fascinating historical episode and a really engaging talk. And I guess what I'd like to do for the next 15 minutes is talk about how the episode we just learned about fits into your larger book. And maybe just a good place to start would be what I took to be one of the major arguments you're making, which is that prints, graphics, in these episodes you're talking about, they're not just byproducts or accompaniments to these movements, but these movements actually happen through the graphics and through the act of printmaking. And so I guess I'm curious what led you to that argument, that realization. Were there particular, in the course of your research, works you encountered that helped you kind of arrive at that idea?
Yeah, thank you. So this project was part of my doctoral dissertation. And so for those of you that plan on going to your PhD, right, usually what we do is that the dissertation goes on to be your book. So this is born from back then. I didn't quite know back then that the two movements, the Mexico City movement and the Chicano farm workers, were going to be so... They're not just parallel movements. They're actually, as you're saying, they're intertwined, but also the images are central to the movements. I didn't quite know all that. At that point, my advisor was helping me, and he suggested that I look at the images of 1968 in Mexico City and the images of the Chicano farm workers. But as I kept researching more and more, I realized that the images were central to the movements, both of them, the Mexico City ones and the Chicano. For example, I realized, again, this wasn't until last year when I was still undergoing peer review, because the peer reviewers weren't convinced at first. And they didn't know whether the last chapter, because this is Mexico, whether I should include Chicanos. Mm-hmm. And so they asked me, this was last summer, they asked me, please work harder, try to make it work. We need to be convinced, research more, look into it. And I did. And I found out that the Mexican printmakers in the 60s traveled to California. And because there's an interview that somebody else did with somebody that is no longer alive, where the Mexican was surprised because the Chicanos were still Catholic and alluding or exploiting the indigenous iconography. Whereas in Mexico City, they weren't religious. They're pretty secular, right? They have Che Guevara, and they are not really alluding to their indigenous roots, right? The Chicanos are. They have the Plan de Aztlán, which we read in our Intro to Chicano or Latinx literature. Gloria Anzaldúa makes references to iconography, etc. So there's that. And also the Chicanos use the prints from the Mexico case. For those students here that are in my classes, we're going to look at that, right? The prints that the Mexicans did in the 50s, the Chicanos used in the 60s. So those two movements are intricately connected. So that's one. But not only are the two movements on either side of the border, of the international border, connected, but the prints are also, as you were saying, essential to the movements. With the Chicano case, I found many references to the fact that boycotting and striking, obviously, they're farm workers and they have a union, but they themselves say that without their newspaper, it's called El Malcriado or the Miscreant, without that newspaper, they wouldn't have been able to disseminate their message. And with that thinking, I was able to go back to the Mexico City case and see how there's something about the visual aspect of it. There's something about visual studies, right? That when you look at culture, it's just universal, right? So the images are really able to disseminate your message. If you have a message to preach or to pass on or whatever, it's the image that really encapsulates everything. So I realized with that thinking, I went back to the students, right, seeing the documentary and reading. Obviously, there's a lot of famous chronicles. There's one by Elena Poniatowska, the famous, she's still alive, she's like 98, and she wrote a book called The Night of Tlatelolco, La Noche de Tlatelolco, which is where the October 2nd massacre happened. And if you read the interviews, you can see the value that students placed on the images themselves, such that whenever we think about 1968 in Mexico City, we need to think about the images as well.
Well, let's take a look at some of those images. I think we have the first image that you can go to, and this is, the book is really wonderful in that, for me, I learned about a lot of artists I didn't know, but this artist is one whose name is quite well known, and I did know, but I wasn't that familiar with his prints. Orozco's better known, I think, as a muralist. But this is the image that you chose to begin your book with. It's in the introduction. And in some ways, it's very different than most of the images in the book. Most of the images are very clear in their political messages. There's, as the observer, the viewer, you can really tell who you're supposed to identify with, who you're supposed to oppose. And in this case, this image is kind of hard to know what to make of. And so I thought it was interesting that you choose this as the point of entry into the book. And so maybe you can just tell us a little bit about this image and why you thought this was a good way to start the story.
Yeah, it's a chaotic image. You're completely right. Especially towards the second half of the 50s, starting in the 40s, 50s, we know what the message is. Here, we don't. So this is a very famous muralist. We know his murals, Jose Clemente Orozco. Those of you in my class, right, we usually see a mural or two by Orozco. But he was a cartoonist, and cartoonists specialize in satire. And of the three muralists, he was the most apolitical, he was the most cynical. And so he did this print, it's called The Masses. He did it in 1935 after he had a stint in the US. He was over here for 5 years. He painted at Dartmouth. You can take a virtual 360 view online for free of the murals that he painted there. He came back to Mexico and he saw people out in the streets protesting, because up until today, Mexicans protest a lot. But in 1935, they saw cracks in their what was supposed to be a revolutionary government. They noticed the government was failing them. It wasn't quite delivering what they wanted. Of course, in 1938, famously Lázaro Cárdenas would give him land. But he saw people protesting. So he was taken aback. And what we see here, first of all, is just people, bodies out in a public space. What are they doing? Are they protesting? They have flags. But the flags don't really show us anything. They're faded, shaded in. They don't have symbols. They don't have a message. The people are yelling. There's mouths. Some of them don't have faces. They don't have heads. They have mouths. So everybody's talking at the same time. It's cacophonous. It's jarring. It's noise. It's not even voices. It's just people talking all at once a lot. And they're also going in different directions. So there's no one direction. They're just out there for the sake of being out there. In the middle, what the son of Jose Clemente Orozco points out, for him, for the son, what stands out the most is in the middle. We see two hands pointing in different directions. And for him, those hands are representative of what Orozco is trying to portray, which is that sometimes bodies are just out in public spaces, not really saying anything, not really going anywhere. And these are thousands of people out there. So I would encourage us to go back and look at his murals and see how cynical he is. It's like seeing today a political cartoon, right? If you're on social media, you look up political cartoons, and they represent so much of society in one snap. So that's what Jose Clemente Orozco is trying to say. And I start the book out this, I actually wanted this image to be the cover of the book, but the copyrights would have made it too difficult. And that was a pain coming up with the copyright. It has 64 images. And if I would have known that it was going to be this much work, I would not have done it. So I think I hope that's another contribution of the book, is that rescuing these images, because a lot of these images, not that they're lost, but you can't go online, you have to go to Mexico City to the archives, like a place called CEMOS, Centro de Estudios del Movimiento Obrero y Socialista, Center for the Socialist and Worker Movement. And it's a house. It's in a very precarious situation. And that place, you have to go there to see some of these images. Not this one. This one's in a museum. But some of these images are not digitized anywhere. So for this one, Orozco has a copyright, and so you have to pay money. That's another thing. And it's another way that my department helped me out to pay some of these copyrights, because it's expensive. And in 10 years, I have to renew the rights or something like that. So that's why I started out with this, because I like the view that is just, there's no one view, like you're saying. It's sort of like just chaos, and it's masses of people, and it's the people. These are the people, but it's one type of people. That's why I have the indefinite article, forging a people, because there's not one the people, even though we practically say the, but the theoretical counterpart is a people, because there's many people. This is one type of people, right? So the idea is to propose different peoples or nations. Sometimes we call them nations. These are alternative. These are subversive. They're counter-hegemonic people that do not align vertically, hierarchically with what the state is telling us a Mexican should be. These are different, horizontal, grassroots type of people.
Yeah, well, and that point about a people rather than the people, that we're looking at artists who all have very different ideas of who the people are, and we see all of these kind of competing visions. And I think particularly your first chapter, which we can look at maybe the covers from those books that you chose. I was kind of surprised when I first encountered these images, because they're so different than most of the other works that you show, which tend to be kind of modernist and adventurous and experimental in their approach. A lot of them are artists who are engaged with radical politics, and these covers of these magazines look quite different from anything else. And so maybe you can just tell us how these works fit into this larger story that you're telling.
Yeah, this first chapter is very much unlike the rest of the chapters. I use it kind of as a way to contrast what we're going to see, because these images belong to one magazine called El Universal Ilustrado, the Illustrated El Universal. And it's a magazine that stopped being in circulation in 1940. And it's a magazine, first of all, it was born in 1917. As my students well know, 1917 is the middle of the revolution, and it's the year that gave us the world's most progressive constitution, with Articles 27 that promised the land to Mexicans, no longer foreign U.S. corporations, and it gave us the Article 123, which promised workers' rights, an 8-hour workday, and other rights of workers. So 1917, during these years, right, 1918, 1921, 1925, we have to remember that the revolution that was fought by peasants, for peasants, had just ended in 1920. And this magazine is one that is, well, I should say that this magazine serves as a repository of important works of literature, like The Underdogs by Mariano Azuela. That's considered one of Mexico's greatest novel, and it was published in El Universal Ilustrado 10 years after it was originally written. And it was a venue for important artists and workers, artists and writers. At the same time, it was a magazine that was focused on fashion. It was a magazine that was focused on quote-unquote modernity. It was a magazine that was focused on European things. It was very Europhile. So what I do is that I contrast that way of thinking. Is not a value judgment against this magazine in particular, but I'm trying to contrast that way of thinking, right? A way of thinking that aligns and supports a quote-unquote modern, which in this context just means being like Europe, being like the United States. Contrast that with the rest of the book. Now, what's interesting about this chapter is that this magazine, which belongs to a newspaper, is still alive today, and they have the copyright for these images. So I had to go to them and ask them permission and pay them. I think they thought that I was very wealthy because they charged me a lot of money. And I don't think they did that with other authors because I read other books and I don't see the copyright symbol on those images. So anyways, what am I going to say? So I went back to my department and I went back to other people. Please help me pay for these images. And I don't think I have to send them a book. I don't know if they're going to be mad, but they can't, I mean, what are they going to say? And it's also, again, it's not gratuitously lambasting the magazine, right? Again, we have to accept and acknowledge the importance that it represented, publishing these authors. But my purpose is contrast that with exactly what's going to come later.
Yeah, and it's not a topic we should get into, but it is an important point you raise, which is the way that these copyrights and the fees that are charged do shape the kind of scholarship that people put out, right? And people with deep pockets are able to research certain topics, and other places may not be able to support that kind of research, and so that's definitely another interesting issue. But as you started to mention, it's like the polar opposite of the chapter that comes after this, and we can maybe talk about this publication, which I am only familiar with because of the photograph that's often reproduced by the famed photographer Tina Medodi, showing the campesinos looking at the newspaper. You can tell us a little bit about the importance of this publication, how it fits into the larger story that you're telling.
Yeah. So this newspaper is not digitized anywhere. You have to find books. There's not that much written about it. There's this book. There's another one that came out in 2017 by John Lear, a professor in Oregon. And there's a few other Mexican books and articles, but not a lot written about it. But it's an incredible newspaper. It started being published in 1924. Very quickly, it started out as the newspaper of a union of artists, but very quickly, within a year, became the official newspaper of the Mexican Communist Party. And the muralists, Orozco, participated and contributed. Diego Rivera, one of the three muralists, and Siqueiros all contributed to the newspaper. So it also represents a repository of important works. Now, as we've been talking about, it's the intersection of art and politics. So I like that picture by Tina Modotti because it just says so much. It tells us so much. It's a great picture. And also, we don't talk enough about Tina Modotti. She was an Italian communist who came to Mexico after the revolution. The revolution opened many venues for foreigners to come in, and they were excited by the opportunities, and intellectuals and writers and photographers. She worked for El Machete for a time, and this image is great because it shows the consumption practices of campesinos, right? So here we have somebody reading El Machete. It says, all the land, not bits of land. That image that is within the newspaper is, I believe, by Orozco also. And we have several campesinos. I also love this image because it goes against what the communists were preaching, because ironically enough, they kept saying in the newspaper, please buy our newspaper. Please buy it. We're going to go out of business. And they did sometimes stop publishing the newspaper. So they kept insisting the readers, please buy it, which is a little ironic because they're communists, but they're asking you to buy their newspaper. But these campesinos in this picture are not buying the newspaper. They're sort of ignoring the communist directives, and they're sharing the newspaper amongst themselves. So it tells us probably because they're poor, right? They're campesinos, they can't afford the newspaper. So they're still getting the message. They're circumventing the Communist Party or directive to buy the newspaper, but nonetheless, they're getting the message. And then this one over here is by Javier Guerrero, who was also another artist along that time, 1924, and it looks to be a print also published in the newspaper.
Yeah, and what I really enjoyed with this chapter was, I think for a sort of uninformed observer like me, who's familiar with Rivera murals, you can get a sense that the radical left-wing politics really comfortably aligned with the state, because you see all of these murals by Rivera with workers and Karl Marx at the top of the composition, and so you think, well, these are state-commissioned works. You get a very different picture when you look at this publication and you see really a movement that is quite subversive and in real tension with the state. And I think that's a dimension that I hadn't fully understood as a kind of passive consumer of just images that I would encounter in the book. So I enjoyed learning about that. I think maybe we can just show the last couple of images from your next chapter, because I think the episode that you mentioned with the popular graphics studio is really produces some of the most, what I think are the most hauntingly beautiful images in the book. And so I'd like for people to be able to see these. But I think maybe if you want to just say a little bit about what these are, and then we can open it up to the audience for, I'm sure, have comments and questions.
Yeah. So the one on the right is Leopoldo Méndez. He is also an understudied artist, a printmaker in Mexico. He was the leader of the TGP, the Taller de Gráfica Popular, the Popular Graphic Art Workshop. And we've rediscovered his work within the past 15 years. So it's very important to keep talking about him. And this is called Unmasked. Teacher Juan Martínez Escobar assassinated before his students in Acámbaro, Guanajuato in 1938. So there's a couple of things that I want to mention about this briefly. One is that, again, the printmaking going back to Posada. The TGP is the heir of Posada. So they pay homage to him often, right? They say Posada, and we all know Posada because we've all seen the Calavera Catrina, right? That's the one that pops up during the Day of the Dead on November 1st and 2nd. So anyways, that's part of what the TGP did. The second thing that I want to say about this print is that it is about Los Cristeros, and this is the Cristero War from 1926 to 1929, which is when the Mexican government, it was very secular, and it's in the Constitution that it has to be secular, waged war against Catholics in the country for 3 years. It was a civil war of the government versus Catholics in the country. And it's convoluted, it's nuanced, it's complex, because rural peasants had a distrust of the government, rightfully so. Distrusted the government when the government sent out teachers and scientists to vaccinate the rural population. The rural people had a distrust. So the rural people, who were often Cristeros, or followers of Christ, or Catholics, they killed the teachers and they killed the scientists that the government sent to rural areas because they had a distrust. So that's the way it was. So anyways, Leopoldo, and as Dr. Benes was saying, it's very important to keep in mind also the government. I very specifically think that we should think of the triangle of the government, the artist, and society, and then in the middle is the image. Because the image that we see is always mediated by the artist, of course, civil society, and the government. And artists in Mexico have had, up until today, I would say, a very close relationship with the government, because the government funded, so 1920, as soon as the revolution, funded the artists, but the artists have always been rebellious. And they always paint Karl Marx and Lenin and Trotsky, controversial people that the United States has hated. And if the United States doesn't like it, it's going to be real hard for, if you're Mexico or whatever country, for you to support that speech, right? But Mexicans have always been sort of leftists, right? And they love painting Karl Marx. And so All this to say that Leopoldo Mendez worked for the government. So that's why he aligns with the government here. And he is painting a peasant. You see the peasant there, his Christ mask is falling. He was a cristero, it's falling, but he's a murderer because he murders the teachers and the scientists. Over here on the left is something similar. It's about the cristeros, and it was painted it was done in 1947, but it's about the 1926 Cristero rebellion. So again, it's making commentary on the current or recent socio-political history and context of Mexico, but they have an agenda sometimes. They work with the government, but sometimes there's conflict. So the types of people that they produce are, sometimes they align with the government narrative, sometimes it doesn't. Right? We have to keep, it's not just one way of portraying. We have to keep in mind all these other nuance. We have to keep in mind the government, what is it doing? Leopoldo Mendez worked for the government at some point. I think that image was commissioned by the government. Keep in mind Catholicism, the history of Catholicism since hundreds of years ago in Mexico, right? There's lots of different things to keep in mind, and that's what I try to do.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, it's an incredibly rich and compelling story that you tell. I think we can open it up to the audience. I'm sure people have questions or comments for Dr. Zavala.
Hello. I'm currently doing a research project about Lance Weinman's involvement in the 1968 Olympic design. I recently read his book, and he talks a lot about working in trying to understand the local cultures and trying to bring that into his logo. But from your talk, it kind of sounds like he was viewed as part of the government's culture against the people. Can you expand how the student protesters viewed Lance Weinman and his design takes?
Yeah, thank you for that question. As I'm responding, I'm going to set up another cycle of images that are it's just going to cycle through, and it's from all the images that I have in the book. So, hopefully it works. I think the students saw that image. I don't think it was specifically against Lance Weinman. I think they just saw it as an official symbol. That the government was, because it was the government that was plastering Lance Weinman's design everywhere. So to put this official, because it was an official design, not Lance Weinman specifically, to put it in such a subversive print was to say, this is the narrative that the government is putting forth for the whole world to see, and the government wants the whole world to see. This is what the government is saying, to think that us, Mexico, are very modern and we're very much in control of our people. And so that's what I think the students thought. It represented that symbol. It represented the official hegemonic narrative of the government. And yeah, I think that's what I would say. I hope that answers your question. Thanks.
Anybody else? Patricia.
Hi. Out of all the prints, why did you choose that one as your front cover? And if so, like, who's the artist?
This one? This is, it's called President Lázaro Cárdenas from 1934 to 40 receives the support of the Mexican pueblo due to his measures in favor of the country's progress. It's a very long title. It is by Ignacio Aguirre. It was published in 1947. Ignacio Aguirre, the artist, belonged to the TGP, the collective that I mentioned earlier. So the cover design was by Lee McDonald. Lee McDonald is an artist that works for the University of Arizona Press. Lee McDonald contacted me and said, can you please send me 10 images that you would like on your cover, and can you make sure that they're copyright free? Mm-hmm. So one of the reasons is that it's copyright free. It didn't cost us money to put it here. I did send them the other one, the masses, that I wanted. That was my number one. But we found out that that would cost money. So that Lee McDonald, they designed this whole thing. right? It's not only the front, but the front and the back.
There it is, right there. And you can see it's a cropped part of the image that they use.
It is cropped. Exactly. That's Cárdenas over here. And that's why.
Is there someone up? No. Okay, I can. You got it. Yeah. I gotta get my stuff. Sorry, I'm making Scott.
Has the Mexican government maintained its robust funding of the arts, or has that gone away? Do you know?
Thank you. Thank you for the question, and thank you for coming. That's a hard question, but I would say overall, if I had to make an overall assessment, I would say that, yeah, we see a lot of governmental support for the arts. One example is for film. Ever since the Mexican golden age of the 1940s and 50s, it's gone up and down. It was 40s and 50s, 60s and 70s, it went down. And then 90s, during the neoliberal era, it started up again. And that's why film in Mexico since 2000, starting with Tu Mamá También, or Amores Perros, right? I think that there's a lot of governmental support for film. That's an example. But overall speaking, I would say the other problem is that it's all concentrated in Mexico City. But Mexico City, I mean, we like to say it's a metropolitan city and there's a lot of museums and a lot of art. It's true. And a lot of that does come from the government. The other thing to keep in mind, oddly enough, is that ever since the 90s, we have very rich people like Carlos Slim, and they're the ones that are also now sponsoring art. It's a little weird because he has a museum that goes by his name, but it has a lot of art, and it's very interesting. So thank you for that question.
Throughout the process of researching and doing the book and everything, is there a specific piece of artwork that you would say really resonates with you, or that, like, do you have any favorites, I guess, and why?
I would have to say that it's the image that I started with. It's all of the images are powerful, but it resonates because learning about 1968 is powerful.
Would you mind going into a little bit more detail about what the political goals of the government were at the time and why they were so particularly opposed to the students' protests, I guess? Because you had mentioned a little bit earlier that they were both like communist offsprings.
So I think the main thing to say about the government's intentions, because that's a good question, first of all. Yes, why are they doing this? Why are they acting this way? We have to ask ourselves that, the why. And I think the main thing to say about why they were doing this is as simple as the whole world was looking at Mexico because it was the Summer Olympics in October. That is a part of it. The other part is that there were simmering tensions that go back to the late 50s between workers and the government. And so I think that's it. I think that's it. I think the government didn't want the world to see that Mexican people were unhappy because they are unhappy. And we're still unhappy, and that's why there's a lot of protests. You know, there's a lot of thinking by there's a Mexican professor at the UNAM called Gilberto Jimenez, and he has a book about Mexican people in public spaces, how that's part of our identity. And it's been part of our identity since 1920, right? Because that's just one democratic way of practicing and showing that you're not content. And I think that's it. I think just the government didn't want the world to see that there is and there was discontent with the people.
This isn't a question, but more of a comment. I find it how interesting how the narrative of that the student movement, how it was dispersed, because historically Latin America, most of our stories are told by word of mouth, like our oral tradition is very strong. So it's really interesting to see that same exact principle just in a visual manner, and like with flyers and the bus ads. Like it's really powerful. It's really interesting.
I do want to say I appreciate the presentation very much. It was very informative. I will ask, because I know topics like this is it gets very in-depth about, the political side of things. Is it like talked about, like taught in like schools? And if so, like how does that like affect the cultural stance within the education system? Like how would that how is that, I don't know, achieved to spread awareness about those past circumstances?
That's a very important question. Thank you for asking it. So, 2 de octubre no se olvida, right? We don't forget 2 de octubre. It's very much alive in the culture and in the collective consciousness of the country. Very, very much alive. It's not that anyone is teaching it necessarily. It's just that it's alive. I'll give you one tragic example that somebody asked what my favorite image was. I think it's the first one because Mexicans live our reality that we live today daily, which in many ways is difficult. But I'll give you one example. In 2014, students from a school right outside Mexico City called Ayotzinapa were going over to Mexico City to commemorate October 2nd. And I mean, what they do is they steal buses to take because they're not rich, right? They don't have money, so they stole buses to go to Mexico City for October 2nd. Going back to, that's what happened that we just said, right? That's what happened in 1968. It culminated with the massacre of hundreds of people on October 2nd. In 2014, what we now know, thanks to the journalist Anabel Hernandez, is that these buses had drugs by narco traffickers. They didn't know this. They stole the buses to go to protest. They didn't know this. And the local police of Ayotzinapa were involved with narco traffickers. So as soon as the students stole the buses, there was, hey, they stole the buses, they have drugs, go get them. They went and got them. And 43 students are missing. We don't know where they're at. That's why today you'll see 43 is everywhere, because it was the state. And during the time, hashtag fue el Estado, hashtag it was the state, because the state, since 1968, nothing's been the same. And the smokescreen that the government wanted us, the people, to believe that it was revolutionary, came tumbling down. And since then, there's a distrust with the government. And it was the government at that time. It was the local police that kidnapped, likely killed the 43 students. They're disappeared. We don't know where they're at. And Argentinian forensics came, and they did the excavation, and they tried to find the bodies. And there's a documentary on HBO called 43. And it's alive. That's why when you asked me my favorite image, because it's alive. It's a daily thing of the state not only not protecting Mexicans, but participating in and colluding with narco traffickers in many instances.
Well, I know that your last talk, you focused a lot on the Chicano movement and the print there that kind of built networks of solidarity with farm workers in more rural locations. And here seems to focus much more on the urban setting and how they organized using prints. So, but there also seems to be a level of distrust between these two groups of these leftist urbanites and the campesinos, the rural farm workers. So how did print and art and muralism help bridge this political disconnect? Because they're both in opposition to the government, but they're also trying to achieve very different aims.
Yes, thank you, Ben. That's exactly right. They're both trying to achieve a better life. So if we start with the common denominator, just as you said, they're both trying to achieve a better life. They're both trying to achieve social justice. They're both trying to resist oppression. In Mexico City, students are trying to protest their oppressive government. The Chicanos are trying to resist a capitalist agribusiness that exploits workers. And as you correctly pointed out, even though there's this common denominator, there's a tension that often happens between students, because students are seen as elite, right? Even here in the US, right? Students are seen as we're just in the classroom or professors or whatever. But students felt a sort of solidarity with workers. And one of their demands, I didn't mention, but they had 6 demands. One of their demands was to liberate political prisoners like Demetrio Vallejo, who had been imprisoned a decade earlier. He was liberated in 1969, finally. And that is the question. How? We got to keep, I don't have one answer, but we have to keep thinking about how students, because I think it's wonderful because it's almost a universal topic. How do students, and students is just not a euphemism, but like an example to talk about the institution or higher education or whatever. How does the student movement come together with the worker movement? And I mentioned Jose Revueltas. He's an example to go to who theorizes. He has this thing about gestión, how to try to bring these two together. And so that's another reason for why we should look at the Chicanos, because it's another example of, even though they're not talking directly to each other, but once we have these things in mind, we can go and see what the Chicanos did. So thanks again for that question.
We have time for one more question.
Wait, that made me lose my question. Oh, okay. I thought it's like very crazy that amidst of all these protests and kind of like a war in its own country, that the Olympics were happening in 1968. So do you think the government agreed to do the Olympics in Mexico to avoid traction from other countries that something's going on in the government, or like almost to like cover up what was going on? And also, how did the Olympics agree to go like forth with that, knowing that everything was going on?
So they had won their bid to be host before the protests. I mean, I don't know exactly the specifics, but I guess it's like a bid, and several countries put a bid to be the host. But I do know that the Olympics have denied countries if there's severe human rights violations, right? That wasn't the case in Mexico because, I don't know, but I do know that there's other countries that the committee of the Summer Olympics have denied if it's too egregious. But in this case, they had already won the bid to be host before the protest of 1968.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Pablo. Let's hear a round of applause.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. Thanks, y'all.
And we can continue the conversation out in the lobby where there's food as well as copies of Professor Zavala's book. And we'll see you all there. Thank you.
I'm going to sell each for $20, each copy.